Welcome, everyone, for the fourth and final lecture in the series on crucial presidential elections. And as you can see, today we are going to be very ambitious and try to cover some 8 elections in American history. Last week, we ended with the election of 1932, which brought FDR to the White House. And today, we're going to begin with the election of 1940, which is certainly significant because for the first time in American history, a president broke with tradition by running for a third consecutive term. Now, there was no law preventing a president from running for a third term, but when George Washington served just 2 terms and then stepped down, that established a tradition that every president followed from Washington to Roosevelt, that they would serve for no more than 2 terms. But in 1940, FDR broke with that tradition. He ran and won a third consecutive term. But the real significance of the 1940 election was its implications for US foreign policy and for the future of the world. Throughout the 1930s, war clouds were gathering in Europe, but the mood of most Americans was decidedly isolationist. Americans wanted to stay out of European affairs. And the reasons for the isolationist sentiment was because when America got involved in World War I, many people felt that that was a mistake. We ended World War I to make the world safe for democracy. It was going to be the war to end all wars. But at the end of World War I, the world was no more safer for democracy than before. And so there was a sense that it was a mistake to get involved in World War I, and we should therefore not get involved in another world war. Another reason for the isolationist sentiment was that during World War I, most of the countries to whom we loaned money failed to repay the war debt. So there was an anti-foreign feeling in America. Also, by the 1930s, we had the economic depression, and that affected the nation's self-confidence, and it dampened any desire to accept overseas responsibilities. We felt we had enough problems at home. Why should we get involved in European problems? And finally, another reason for isolationism has to do with geography. Yes, Europe seemed to be going to hell in a handbasket, but we felt isolated from that. The Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean protected us from getting involved in any foreign conflicts. And so as these war clouds gathered, Americans were determined not to get sucked into yet another European war, as we can see from this cartoon. And to keep America out of European conflicts, Congress passed a series of Neutrality Acts that were intended to insulate America from European conflicts. So in 1935, the Neutrality Act imposed an embargo that prevented Americans to sell any war material to any belligerents. 1936, Americans were prohibited from loaning money to any belligerents. By 1937, Americans were prohibited from traveling on any ships of nations at war. Now, belligerents could purchase non-military goods, but only on a cash and carry basis. Now, ever since September of 1939, when World War II began, a great debate began to rage over the direction of American foreign policy. By 1940, Nazi Germany had established a domination over Europe, dominating these countries in red. The only country that was standing against Nazi Germany by the summer of 1940 was Great Britain. Russia had a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, and Spain and Portugal were neutral. And so by the time France fell to the Nazis in June of 1940, FDR was convinced that it was in America's interests to aid Britain, but isolationist sentiment kept Roosevelt from doing anything to help England. And so here is a cartoon of England as represented by Johnny Bull, who says to Roosevelt, "Frankie, ain't you coming over?" And here's Roosevelt in prison. He says, "No, darn it, I can't get out." And the prison is US sentiment. So again, Roosevelt wanted to do something to help Britain, but certainly Congress would not go along with it. And isolationists like Charles Lindbergh insisted that the United States stay out of World War II. The question of what the United States should do in regards to Europe dominated the presidential campaign of 1940. And crucial to that question was who the Republicans would nominate to run against Roosevelt. Most notable Republicans were isolationists. And in 1940, it looked as if the Republicans would nominate an isolationist candidate for president. Most political observers thought the Republicans would nominate either staunchly isolationist Senator Robert Taft, whom you see here. He was the son of President Taft. He was the senator from Ohio. Or some thought that the Republicans would nominate Thomas Dewey, governor of New York. Taft was the rising star in the Republican Party, and Dewey made a name for himself by fighting crime in New York. And there was also a dark horse, Senator Arthur Vandenberg from California. They were all isolationists, especially Taft and Vandenberg, who were outspoken in their objections to President Roosevelt's sympathy with Great Britain. But a newcomer to politics, Wendell Willkie, was even a darker horse. Willkie was a Wall Street lawyer who was not an isolationist, which made his nomination even more unlikely. He was something of a maverick without any political experience. He openly favored aiding Great Britain, much to the dismay of old guard Republicans. The Republican convention was held, however, only days after the fall of France, and that had shocked most Americans. American public opinion, as a result, began to shift as Nazi successes in Europe began to show how misguided the isolationists were. Republican delegates in Philadelphia were as shocked as any other Americans by the fall of France, and Willkie was the only notable Republican who supported Roosevelt's efforts to aid Britain. Influential newspaper publishers like Henry Luce of Time magazine and wealthy New York bankers and businessmen, they supported Willkie's nomination. And so when the balloting began, Dewey led on the first 3 ballots, but he could not achieve a majority. The galleries at the Republican convention strongly favored Willkie, and they erupted into chants, "We want Willkie." Willkie took the lead on the 4th ballot, but Taft was still close behind. Finally, on the 6th ballot, Willkie won. Nothing exactly like it had ever happened in American politics. Willkie had never before held public office, nor did he even seek it. He was a virtual neophyte in politics. He entered no primaries, he made no deals, he organized no campaigns. On the Democratic side, if there had been no crisis, it's possible that FDR would not even have chosen to run. But once he decided to break the 2-term tradition, he wanted it to seem that the Democrats demanded that he run again rather than seeking the nomination on his own. At the nominating convention in Chicago, the mayor of Chicago arranged for the city's superintendent of sewers to place microphones under the auditorium. And on a prearranged signal, a voice from the sewers boomed over the loudspeakers, "We want Roosevelt! We want Roosevelt!" Demonstrators at the convention took up the chant, and FDR won an overwhelming majority on the first ballot. And he went on to win the 1940 election, winning every state in red, 38 states in all. The Electoral College tally was 449 votes to Roosevelt, 82 for Wilkie. And so the election was the definitive turning point in Roosevelt's fight with the isolationists. Now the president could move ahead with aiding Britain. And because of Wilkie, the isolationists in Congress could not make a major issue of it. The immediate result was an executive order that Roosevelt issued calling for a transfer of American ships to Great Britain, 50 overaged World War I destroyers sent to Great Britain. By 1941, Roosevelt announced that America would be an arsenal for democracy. Now, this is before we entered the war. By March of 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Bill, where the United States would lend or lease military equipment to Great Britain and now to the Soviet Union, which after June of 1941 was fighting Nazi Germany. By August 1941, Roosevelt met with Churchill and they assigned the Atlantic Charter, in which they announced common aims during the war. So that is the significance of the election of 1940. So now we are going to turn to the election of 1948. The presidential election of 1948 is considered by most historians, up until the election of 2016, as the greatest election upset in American history. Virtually every prediction indicated that the incumbent president, Harry S. Truman, would be defeated by the Republican candidate, Thomas E. Dewey. There were several reasons for Truman's unpopularity in 1948. He had alienated labor unions by threatening to draft striking railroad workers into the army. Farmers and consumers were angry over rampant inflation that was plaguing the country in 1948. Conservatives were angry over Truman's decision to extend the benefits of the New Deal. Southerners were upset over Truman's support for civil rights. Truman issued an executive order to desegregate the military. Liberals were angry because Truman took an anti-Soviet stance. So it seemed as if there was no one who would support Truman in 1948. By the 1946 congressional elections, Truman was so unpopular with his own party that Democrats who were running for the House and the Senate actually asked Truman to stay away and not campaign for them. In the 1948 presidential election, professional gamblers had Truman a 50-to-1 shot to win. Those were the odds against Truman winning. Out of 50 political writers at that time, not a single one would predict a Truman victory. Not one pollster of the hundreds covering the election thought that Truman had a chance of winning. And to make matters worse, there was a split in the Democratic Party. Truman was the Democratic nominee, but leftists in the Democratic Party felt that Truman wasn't progressive enough. And so Henry Wallace organized the Progressive Party, in which he was the candidate. So the left wing of the Democratic Party broke away. And Strom Thurmond from South Carolina formed the States' Rights Democratic Party. And so you had three Democrats running in 1948, which meant that the Democratic vote would be hopelessly split. Truman's popularity was at 36% in 1948. That's even lower than Trump's popularity today. But despite all of this, Truman won the 1948 election. As we can see from this map, he won 49.5% of the popular vote to 45.1% for Dewey. He won all the states in green. Dewey won all the states in purple, and Strom Thurmond won the states in orange. Truman won 303 electoral votes to 189 for Dewey. Thurmond and Wallace trailed far behind with only 2.4% of the vote, although Thurmond did win 39 electoral votes from those southern states. So the question is, how did Truman win? Well, he repaired his relationship with labor by vetoing the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed by the Republican-dominated Congress, which was intended to break up labor unions, and Truman vetoed that bill. He also won over Black Americans by supporting civil rights, and he continued to embrace New Deal programs with support for national health insurance, with support for higher minimum wage and federal housing measures. And these were important to liberals. He also condemned the Republican Congress as the do-nothing Congress. And that was very popular with Democrats. But another reason why Truman won had to do with the weakness of his Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey. Some Democrats referred to Dewey as the little man atop the wedding cake. Dewey thought that he was a shoo-in to win, and so he ran a very smug campaign. He did very little, while Truman ran a very aggressive campaign. But the major reason for Truman's victory in 1948, underlying all other reasons, was there was peace in the country and there was prosperity. And so the New Deal coalition of Blacks, workers, and big city Democrats, these coalitions held together to guarantee Truman victory in 1948. Now we're going to look at the election of 1960. When we look at this Kennedy-Nixon election, most people think about the impact of the first televised debates in American history. But this election was famous, or maybe infamous, for another reason. It was quite possibly the most fraudulent election in American history. Now, some of you may be very shocked to hear that. It was a startlingly close election. There was a near toss-up in a dozen states or more, with just 118,000 votes separating the candidates. Without Illinois or Texas, there was a risk that neither candidate would be able to get the required 270 electoral votes, and therefore it would have been thrown into the House of Representatives for the first time since 1824. The entire election turned on Illinois, where Kennedy won by just 9,400 votes. He won the state of Illinois largely because of Chicago. In Chicago, he won by 456,000 votes. The turnout in Chicago was reported at 89.3%. That is an incredible turnout, and the huge margin that he won Chicago by was almost implausible. So how did it happen? Well, it turns out that 177 members of the 180-member Chicago Board of Election Commissioners were Democrats. Second here. And these Democrats had been appointed by Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley. Sorry for the typographical error in his name. And so Daley appointed 177 of 180 members to Chicago's Board of Election Commissioners. And suspecting possible voter fraud, an outfit called the Committee for Honest Elections put in a request to send observers to polling stations in order to monitor the election. But Daley accused the committee of Republican bias and refused the request. A special prosecutor dug up enough dirt to indict 677 Chicagoans on charges of voter fraud in the 1960 election. The cases were moved out of Chicago to a court of a Daley crony in East St. Louis, Illinois, who then squashed the cases. So there was never any punishment for the 677 accused of voter fraud. The Chicago Tribune uncovered hard evidence that the Daley machine habitually registered vagrants for the purposes of stealing their votes. The newspaper unearthed stories of uncooperative Republican election judges being locked up in police custody on election day, and stories that ward bosses were threatened with expulsion from office if they couldn't come up with the votes expected of them. But this evidence emerged years after the 1960 election. Now, why didn't Nixon challenge the result if there was such voter fraud? Well, Nixon knew he was fighting an unwinnable battle against a political machine that was dedicated to his defeat. That is the political machine of Richard Daley. Also, Nixon didn't want to draw attention to any dishonesty committed on his own behalf. It's also possible that the votes for Kennedy were there, but the question is, how were those votes generated? Robert McDonald, a leading Chicago attorney specializing in organized crime, admitted he set up a meeting between Joseph Kennedy, that is John Kennedy's father, and Chicago mobster Sam Giancana. McDonald said that the mob dragged out the required number of Chicagoans in order to deliver Illinois for Kennedy. Giancana was heard on wiretap, offering his support for Kennedy in return for Kennedy's promise to back off from an FBI investigation of the Chicago mob. And because of all of this, Nixon nursed a grudge against Kennedy for the rest of his career. It's entirely plausible that the memory of being cheated in Chicago in 1960 can only have led to the Watergate scandal. That is, Nixon wanted to make sure that something like that would not happen in the 1972 election. Remember, the illegal break-in was all about nailing down Nixon's second term in the White House at any cost. The next election we will look at is the election of 1968. Lyndon Baines Johnson was the sitting president, and he would have won his party's nomination without any trouble. But growing opposition to the war in Vietnam, along with unrest on college campuses and urban rioting, all of that made Johnson vulnerable. Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota announced that he would oppose Johnson in seeking the Democratic nomination, and that if he was elected, he would end the Vietnam War. In the New Hampshire primary in March of 1968, McCarthy shocked the political world by winning 42% of the vote. Remember, he was running against a sitting president. Now, while he did not win the primary, the size of his support represented a defeat for Johnson. And so, sensing Johnson's vulnerability, Robert Kennedy, senator from New York, then entered the race for the Democratic nomination. And so that, along with renewed opposition to the war, all of that prompted Johnson to announce that he would not run for re-election. In response, Vice President Hubert Humphrey entered the race. But by the time he decided to enter the race, it was too late for him to run in the primaries. And so he would have to win delegate support at the nominating convention in Chicago that summer. In the meantime, Robert Kennedy quickly gained immense popularity in the race. He won primaries in Indiana and Nebraska. But McCarthy did not give up. He won contests in Wisconsin and Oregon. When Kennedy won the climactic primary in California, it put him within reach of securing the Democratic nomination. But Kennedy's assassination strengthened Humphrey's bid for the Democratic nomination. And by late August, Humphrey controlled the majority of the delegates at the Democratic convention in Chicago. Despite the protests of thousands of students and anti-war demonstrators in the streets outside the Democratic convention, Humphrey received the nomination from an embattled Democratic Party. And like the Republican Party of today, the 1968 campaign ripped apart the Democratic Party, torn between a liberal anti-war wing and a conservative racist Southern Democratic wing. And when I refer to the Republican Party today, I'm referring to those Lincoln Republicans who today are refusing to vote for Trump. Now, the 1968 presidential election saw the entry of a third-party candidate. George Wallace, governor of Alabama, entered under the American Independent Party. On election day, the popular vote was very close. This is the result. Nixon won all the states in red, Humphrey won the states in blue, and Wallace won the states in gray. And so you can see that Nixon won 43.4% of the popular vote. Humphrey, 42.7%. So the race was very close. George Wallace won 13.5% of the popular vote. But while the popular vote was very close, Nixon won a sizable majority of the electoral vote, 301 to 191 for Humphrey. Despite the closeness of Nixon's victory, it represented a resounding mandate against Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party. The election of 1968 was noteworthy for the following reasons. It was one of the few times that a sitting incumbent president was not the party nominee. The last time this happened was when Calvin Coolidge was president. And he chose not to run for re-election in 1928, just as Johnson chose not to run in 1968. The election was also significant because it was the last time a third-party candidate was able to win as much electoral support as George Wallace did when he won several states in the South. 1968 was a realignment election. Democrats had long held power in Congress, mainly because it had received support from what was called the Solid South. The South had voted Democratic since the end of the Civil War. For reasons that are obvious, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And so Democrats in the South were strongly against Republicans, and for a century, Southern voters voted solidly Democratic. But Johnson's support for civil rights, along with Nixon's Southern strategy, ended that Democratic dominance in the South. And so from the 1968 election on, the South began to vote Republican. Now we're going to look at the election of 1980. By the time the 1980 campaign had begun, the country was growing increasingly dissatisfied with liberal, democratic, big government candidates. As the months rolled by, the nation was racked by high inflation and unemployment, gasoline shortages, and a hostage crisis in Iran, in which more than 50 Americans were held captive. These were the issues that embattled President Jimmy Carter, who was just the second president in the 20th century to run for re-election when the national economy was shrinking. The other president who was running when the economy was shrinking was Herbert Hoover. By 1980, Carter's approval rating had fallen to, get this, 21%. That's lower than Nixon's rating at the time of Nixon's resignation. And it's much lower than Trump's rating today. Carter seemed weak and powerless, and voters felt down on their luck and deeply worried about the future. This enabled Reagan during the debates to ask millions of Americans, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Reagan urged Americans to believe in themselves again, and he declared that the United States was a shining city on a hill whose best days were still ahead. Reagan swept into the White House by promising dramatic tax cuts, by promising a rollback of the federal government, a dramatic rebuilding of America's military might, and a return to what he called traditional American values. He defeated Carter in a landslide, winning all the states in red, winning 44 million votes, or 50.7% of the popular vote, and 489 electoral votes to Carter's 35.5 million votes and only 44 electoral votes. So this election marked a historic departure from the path that FDR set towards bigger government. And this election shattered the New Deal coalition that had dominated American politics for most of the previous half century. Workers who had consistently voted Democratic. Now, those workers who voted for Reagan were called Reagan Democrats. Reagan's victory was a watershed election It signaled a conservative resurgence in American politics. It represented an attack on big government, an attack on Lyndon Johnson's Great Society liberalism, an attack on the activities and the ideas of the 1960s student rebels. Critics consider the Reagan Revolution reactionary, that it was an assault against the liberal gains over the previous 50 years, an attack on the New Deal, an attack on those liberal gains that had democratized and humanized America. Critics claim that Reagan's trickle-down economics widened the gap between the rich and the poor, that it encouraged greed and threatened the accomplishments of the civil rights movement, of the feminist movement, and the environmental movement. But after 1980, liberalism seemed to be discredited in the decades that followed. Between 1980 and 2008, no presidential candidate in either party was willing to describe himself as a liberal. That is a 28-year period. And since 1980, the Republican Party has grown increasingly conservative. The Republican Party is so conservative today that if Reagan was running for the nomination for the Republican Party, it's doubtful that he would win the nomination because by today's standard, Reagan wasn't conservative enough. Even John Kasich, considered to be a moderate Republican, even he attacks big government and called for increased tax cuts. So this is the significance of the 1980 election. Now we will turn to an election that we all remember, the 2000 presidential election. This campaign between George W. Bush and Al Gore was one of the most extraordinary in all American history. Not because of the campaign itself, but because of the results. On election night, no clear winner emerged. And ultimately, as we all remember, the contest focused on Florida. Television networks initially projected Gore the winner in Florida, but later they declared that Bush had opened an insurmountable lead in that state. Gore telephoned Bush to concede the election, but in the early hours of the following morning, it became apparent that the Florida race was much closer than Gore's staff had originally believed. Fewer than 600 votes separated the candidates, and that margin appeared to be narrowing. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, Gore called a stunned Bush to retract his concession. Florida state election law required a mandatory statewide machine recount. County officials tried to discern voter intent through a cloud of, remember this, hanging chads. So this is a hanging or chad, also called a door chad, where this little flap is hanging. And you're supposed to take off that flap. Some of these flaps are called swinging door chads. Some were called dimple chads or pregnant chads. Paper ballots, a pregnant chad are paper ballots that were dimpled but not pierced during the voting process. There were also overvotes, that is, ballots that recorded multiple votes for the same office. And there were undervotes, ballots that recorded no vote for a given office. Also at issue was the so-called butterfly ballot, which you see here. That was used in Palm Beach County, which caused confusion amongst some Gore voters. Some of those voters inadvertently cast their vote the third party candidate, Pat Buchanan, who's, this is here, you had to indicate this button for Buchanan, and this button would be for Gore. And this is the butterfly ballot because of these two sides. So there were some Gore voters who pushed the button for Pat Buchanan thinking that they were voting for Gore. In fact, Buchanan received 3,400 votes statewide, many of them because voters thought they were voting for Gore. Eventually, the Florida Supreme Court decided on a 4-3 vote to order a statewide manual recount of approximately 45,000 undervotes. That is, ballots that machines recorded as not clearly expressing a presidential vote. And if those votes were discounted, it would reduce Bush's lead to just 154 votes. And so the Bush campaign quickly filed an appeal with the US Supreme Court, asking it to delay the recount until the Supreme Court could hear the case. And so a stay was issued by the court until December 9th. Florida's state Supreme Court said the hand counts could continue, but it set a deadline of September 18th for this recount to be completed. But 3 days later, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 ruling, said that federal election law specified a December 12th deadline for states to certify the winner in each state. And therefore, it would be too late to allow any statewide recount to proceed. And so, by ordering a stop to the Florida recount, the Supreme Court effectively awarded the presidency to George W. Bush. And again, the Supreme Court made this ruling on a 5-4 vote. Sandra Day O'Connor was the swing vote on that. And so, by winning Florida, Bush narrowly won the electoral vote 271 to 266. 271 is just one more than the absolute minimum required for elections. One Gore elector even abstained from voting. But Gore won the popular vote, as you can see here. He won the popular vote by some 500,000 votes over Bush. And so this represented the fourth time in American history that the candidate who won the popular vote lost the presidential election. As a postscript to this 2000 election, among the Republican lawyers pushing for the Supreme Court to suspend the counting of the Florida ballots, among these Republican lawyers were John Roberts, today the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. So, 3 sitting Supreme Court justices were involved in the 2000 election that the Supreme Court decision that gave George W. Bush the presidency. And that raises the question as to whether Roberts, Kavanaugh, or Barrett should recuse themselves in the event that the Supreme Court might once again intervene in the 2020 presidential election. That is a possibility. Now let us look at the 2016 election. The election of 2016 was historic in several ways. It represented the first time that a woman ran for president from a major political party. Hillary Clinton was also the first spouse of a president to run for the Oval Office. And Donald Trump if you're not aware of it now, was in many ways an unusual president. He was the first president who had neither served in the military nor held government office.
It's hilarious.
At the age of 70, Trump became the oldest president ever to be inaugurated. And Trump is also the first president to be married more than twice. The 2016 election, once again, saw the candidate who won the popular vote not winning the presidency. This is the fifth time that that has happened. 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016. And so here you can see that Hillary Clinton won 65.8 million votes to Trump's 62.9 million. So that is a difference of nearly 3 million votes. Nevertheless, Trump won 304 electoral votes to Hillary Clinton's 227. And you may remember in the first lecture in this series, when I discussed the Electoral College, I explained how this could happen. This happens when a candidate wins large populated states by an overwhelming margin, as Hillary Clinton did in California and New York. But she lost other states by a very narrow margin. And so while Trump lost the popular vote, when you add up all the electoral votes, he was declared the winner. Now, the election that will take place next week might be the most controversial since the 1860 election for a number of reasons. The election is taking place against the backdrop of a pandemic, against the backdrop of a deluge of mail-in ballots, never before seen in American campaign history. Also, with an overburdened postal service, with a resurgent effort to suppress votes, and undoubtedly, there will be a barrage of lawsuits that will challenge some of these returns. Trump has already claimed that mail-in ballots are suspect, that many of them are fraudulent. And so there is a high probability that we will not know the results for days or even weeks after the November 3rd election day. Now, there are some very important dates after November 3rd. On December 8th, states have to certify which candidate has won in the respective states. This is called Safe Harbor Day. Now, if these ballots are disputed, it's possible that some states cannot determine which candidate has won. Now, if that happens, that state's electoral votes will not count. And if that happens in several states, it's possible that neither Trump nor Biden might gain the required 270 electoral votes. And as we have seen in the course of these lectures, when no candidate wins a majority, it gets thrown into the House of Representatives. That has happened in 1800 and has happened in 1824. If the election is thrown into the House, then the delegates from each state, that is the delegates to the House of Representatives from each state, have collectively one vote. So there are 53 representatives from California. And the majority of those 53 representatives are Democratic. And so if the election is thrown into the House, the California delegates will cast their vote for Biden, but that's just one vote. All 53 delegates will collectively have one vote. And the one delegate from Wyoming has just one representative in the House of Representatives. That representative is a Republican. And so that Republican will cast his vote for Trump. And so Wyoming and California have equal weight in the House of Representatives when the House decides who will be president. But what's interesting here is that the representatives in the House who may be voting for president will not be the current representatives in the House. It will be the new representatives, those who will be voted in on November 3rd. Now, if the House voted today, there are 26 state majority Republican versus only 24 majority Democratic states. But we don't know what the result will be after November 3rd. There's another curious thing. If the vote is turned into the House will vote to see who will be the president. The Senate will vote to see who will be vice president. So it is possible, certainly it's improbable, but it is possible that we could wind up with a Trump presidency with Kamala Harris as vice president, or a Biden presidency with Mike Pence as vice president. It's improbable, but it is possible. So there are lots of scenarios that might play out in the upcoming election. We really are in uncharted seas. There are other possible scenarios. There is a scenario where on the night of the election, Trump may be way ahead because in-person voters tend to be more Republican than Democrat. But those who mail in the ballot, they are more likely to be Democrats than Republicans. And so it is possible that on the night of November 3rd, Trump may be ahead and he may declare himself winner. But when the mail-in ballots are counted, it's possible that Biden will wind up with more votes. But if you look at Trump's track record, it's unlikely that he will concede. He has already stated that if he loses, then the election must be rigged. So stay tuned on November 3rd. And like Betty Davis once said, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And so that concludes the lectures on critical elections in American history.